Houseguest installed Deadbolt after reminder to leave. A childhood friend of my wife's, call him Pete, moved back to the area after the death of a parent and losing his job. We offered to let him crash in our spare bedroom for a month or so, while he gets things figured out. Pete moved in on 3/28, and we had him sign something that said that he'd split on 6/30, whether he had his shit sorted or not. This was partially to put a hard limit on the amount of time he'd be living with us, but primarily because my brother is going to spend about 6 weeks in town for work starting in mid-July and will be staying with us. Pete didn't seem to be in much of a rush to find a new job, let alone find his own place, but he's in a bit of a funk due to the whole situation, so we'd been giving him the benefit of the doubt. On 6/1, my wife reminded Pete of the fact that he had to go at the end of the month. He said not to worry, and that he'd definitely have something figured it out by then. She gave him the same reminder this Wednesday, 6/12. I'll spare you the details, but this time Pete countered by confessing that he'd always been in love with her, and that she should leave me, and I could find a new place while they stay in the apartment, which is sort of funny because while I consider this to be her apartment as much as mine, I purchased it before we met, and her name isn't on anything. Anyway, she obviously shut this down immediately, and Pete did not respond well. At all. No violence, but a ton of shouting, insulting, and attempting to guilt trip. It was intense enough that my wife just cut out to her mother's place, where she called me to fill me in on the situation. I went home from work and told Pete that we'd stick to the agreement despite his behavior, but the sooner he was out, the better. I spoke to my wife later that evening, and we decided till Pete fucks off, she'll stay in an investment property of mine that is luckily vacant right now, but I'd start working remotely and stay at the apartment more or less 24/7, both to make sure Pete doesn't do anything stupid, and because my presence in the living room would hopefully be more than a little awkward for him. So this morning, around 6 o'clock, I left to run to the office to grab some stuff I'll need while working from home. I got back to the apartment about half an hour ago, and as I stepped out of the elevator, I saw a guy with a toolbox leaving my apartment, and immediately noticed that a new deadbolt had been installed in the door. I tried to explain the situation to the locksmith, but he basically told me that the lock's already in, and he gave the only key to the guy in the apartment, so it's between the two of us now. Lovely. I asked him for a card, and he said he didn't have any, so I asked where he works. He told me that it isn't any of my business, and reiterated that this is between me and Pete. I followed him downstairs, and luckily he was in a van that had a sticker with the company's name and info on the side. I called the number, asked to speak to the boss, and told him what had happened. He more or less did his best to not answer any of my questions. I'm sorry, but I don't have to inform you of our policies. Fun. So this is where I am at now. I called the police just to get a report filed. But I am 100% sure that when the officers show up, they're going to tell me that it's a civil issue. I'm not expecting them anytime soon, as this is a pretty small potatoes deal in the city, where the whole thing is taking place. I was actually all set to offer Pete a cash for keys deal if he wasn't getting his shit in gear by 6/23, but I have a feeling that I am going to have to evict now. I own a few investment properties and have gone through the eviction process before, so I know that will not be a fun process given how tenant-friendly my state is, but it is what it is. We've got that vacant rental property to stay in while everything gets sorted out, so that's covered as well. My only questions now are about who I can go after for what. On that note, here are my questions. I am going to lose money on the rental that my wife and I will be staying in while the eviction gets handled. In fact, I've already done so, as I had just started advertising it, and will now have to pull the listing on a few sites, drop a sorry but on anyone who responds to print ads I placed. Is this something I can sue for? In my mind, I'd name both Pete and the locksmith company in a suit, and let the judge decide who owes me what. But since I am making the decision for us to occupy the space, do I technically have damages? When I got a deadbolt installed at my old rental, I had to show the locksmith a copy of my lease before they'd even touch the door. Was that just a company policy they were following? Or is that mandated by law? If the latter, is there anything I can go after them for? I don't care if it's trying to get criminal charges pressed or just going the civil route. I am not hurting for money, so frankly, if I were to sue it, would be more about taking the pound of flesh that I feel I am entitled to after they locked me out of my own home, but I'd be just as happy seeing the pound of flesh extracted in a manner that does not end with me in possession of it. Anything else that I should be thinking about in this situation? I am planning on asking the police to do a civil standby or whatever it's called, so I can get a few important things out of the apartment. I am a little flustered and pissed off right now, to say the least, so I just want to make sure that there isn't anything I should be considering beyond that. Update 1. So I got a call while I was getting ready to head back to the apartment to meet the locksmith. It was Pete's brother. Apologies for the lack of details here, but I don't know too much about exactly what went down, and a chunk of what I do know is sort of personal shit that the brother, who just did me an enormous favor, probably wouldn't want me sharing. Anyway, the gist of the phone call was that he went by and performed a third-party constructive eviction with the back of his hand. So Pete's gone, as is most of his stuff. His brother is going to swing by next week to grab any odds and ends that they may have missed. I am planning on making him dinner and hitting him off with a bottle of good whiskey when he does so. As far as Pete goes, I'm thinking that I'll follow through with at least the early part of the eviction process just in case he tries anything cute. Gonna speak to my attorney about this first, but he's still in the wind. Turns out he's staying at a cabin his girlfriend's family owns, and it's pretty much as close to being in the middle of nowhere as human-built structures get. His admin, paralegal, I don't know what she is specifically, but she said that yesterday was the one day he wasn't going into town for cell service. This gives us the opportunity to convince him that the situation is currently way worse than it ever was. And as much as I love this guy, he's really fun to fuck with, so that's cool. After speaking with him, I called the owner of the locksmith to let him know that the apartment was vacant, so his guy wouldn't need to show up with police. Turns out he was planning on coming by to handle this himself anyway, so that was easy enough. I met him over there. He had a handful of deadbolts for me to choose from, and he switched out the lock in about 5 minutes. We got to bullshitting about baseball because that's what you do in New York, and this led to him accepting my offer to buy him a beer so we could watch the White Sox smack our Yankees around. I got some backstory at the bar, and while this is secondhand information, the dude seems pretty reliable, so I've got no reason not to believe him. The guy who came over yesterday morning was indeed an employee of his, but he wasn't on the clock and actually borrowed the deadbolt without mentioning anything. Turns out, he is an old friend of Pete's and had been fed a story about an insane landlord who had decided to move into the apartment Pete was renting. Brilliant. Anyway, my new locksmith buddy told me that this guy was officially unemployed as of that afternoon. I'd feel bad for the dude, but I'm too busy not caring about what his motivation was due to the complete and total lack of any attempt to verify the story he'd been fed. This also explains the non-answers I got when I called the shop. The person I spoke to was a manager who had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. He was basically trying to buy some time to speak with the owner and the guy who installed the deadbolt, instead of just pulling an excuse out of his ass for me. I wish he'd told me that in the first place, but I do appreciate the fact that he didn't just try to go into CYA mode for the company, his, now former, co-worker. All in all, I have a new preferred locksmith for when I need something done at any of my properties. So really, the only legal shit left is the restraining order, and Pete very kindly sent my wife a few emails last night upon figuring out that she'd blocked his number. Not gonna go into detail, but I'll just say that the contents should make the restraining order easy to get.